Hey guys, welcome back to the Why Wars Happen History podcast, where you learn about the causes of wars and things like, why did it happen? Was it inevitable? Who was involved? Sometimes I go back hundreds of years just so we can understand what the hell happened. And if you want to talk more about war, we also have authors, historians, war generals, royalty, actors, filmmakers, a whole bunch of people come on as guests, and we talk about everything about war before, during, and after war. So let's go. Welcome to the Why Wars Happen History podcast, where we sit down with filmmakers, historians, and authors, and we talk about the wars in history. Today, our guest is John Orloff. He is an award-winning screenwriter, producer, Shakespeare fan. You see a lot of Shakespeare in his past. He was also one of the screenwriters for Band of Brothers and screenwriter and executive producer for today's topic, Masters of the Air, which you can see as a miniseries on Apple TV, exclusively on Apple TV. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So, first thing I got to say, you are crazy good at scene cuts. Was that you? Did you put those scene cuts in there, or did someone else do that? Because
what do you mean by scene cuts?
Like the way that scenes transitioned in between this one and this one, and where to. God, that was masterful.
Well, it's all about structure. It's all about structure. I think that Billy Wilder, the film director, would say that for every 500 screenwriters, only 3 would understand structure, really? And how important it is. So yeah, I spend a lot of time on structure. And that includes like where you break things up and where a scene ends and all that. That was just masterful. Like I'm a writer myself, and so I'm watching that going like, damn, this is like flawless where these things end and bleed into the next one. This is very cool. And so I wanted to ask, you also helped develop the series Masters of the Air. It wasn't just I didn't help develop it. I developed it.
You developed it. You're like, I did it. Like, okay.
I wrote a 250-page outline of the show with 500 footnotes because, before I even wrote a script. And then I spent years writing the episodes before Apple came on board. I wrote it for HBO, and then HBO decided not to make it, but we had 7 or 8 scripts written already. So, and then Apple decided to make it. So yeah, that it was all just me, myself, and I until that moment. So I'd written about 700 pages before the show was even greenlit. Firstly, the Bible, what we call the Bible, which is the outline, which, as I said, was 250 pages, was necessary because the book is really, really great, but it's not about the 100th Bomber Group. It's about the entire air war against Nazi Germany from the 8th Air Force, which was based in England. So the book talks more about Winston Churchill and Eisenhower than it does about our characters.
Interesting.
So they're in about 50, 60 pages of a 700-page book. So they're in there a little bit, like the Regensburg mission, or just little vignettes of true stories. But then a lot wasn't explained. So my first task was to figure out what basically Egan, Cleven, and Crosby and Rosie did from, June of 43 until VE Day in a calendar sequential way. And then because there was no book about them, or I didn't really discover, there was no book about our major characters. Although, scratch that, Crosby wrote a memoir, but I didn't find that for a while. But like the 500 footnotes were because it had to be true, right? And when I went to the script writing process, and there was the probability that there would be other screenwriters, they needed to know where I got certain beats so that they could expand on them in script form.
Interesting. Okay.
So I had about 25 sources for the series.
Wow.
Because unlike Band of Brothers, the guys were not alive. So when we made Band, I could call up Major Winters, I could call up Lipton, I could call up Malarkey on the phone and say, you know, what happened when you were doing this? And they would tell me. In this case, in Masters, our 4 major characters had passed. So I had to figure out what they did by other means, which included reading a lot of Air Force after mission reports.
Okay.
Yeah, every plane you see in the show, even if you don't know what it is a real plane. Meaning, when you see a formation of B-17s, we, the filmmakers, know which plane every single plane is. Not just the hero planes that Crosby or Egan and Cleven are in. We track them all for the whole sequence. So, for example, in episode 5, the Munster mission, when these numbers, it's been a little bit of time. I think it was 17 planes took off. 4 returned, which was very normal for mechanical problems, leaving 13, I think, that actually, went to the target. Well, those 13 planes, we know which each one is, and we know where each one was in the formation. And as they go down, that's really the plane, that's really a plane that went down. And mostly it's how it really happened. Sometimes the directors would take a little creative license.
Wow.
But even if you don't know what plane number 4 is to Cleven's left,
yeah,
I did.
Wow. So we're seeing, when you're watching that, you're like, this is as close as you can get to what actually happened. That's incredible. Wow.
Yeah.
That's really
it was
rare. Wow.
Yes. Well, that was, but this was part of a family of shows, Band of Brothers and the Pacific. Mm-hmm. Granted, this was not made at HBO, but it was still Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg and me. And so that was kind of, I think Band of Brothers instilled in me the responsibility of getting it right. Everybody on Band of Brothers connected to people, the real guys. So, Frank John Hughes, who played Bill Garnier, ended up becoming deep, deep friends with Bill for the rest of Bill's life. I was close to Dick Winters for the rest of his life. So the responsibility of getting their stories right was not only important to us from a dramatic standpoint and a creative standpoint, but also we couldn't disappoint the guys, particularly Dick Winters. Dick was a pretty judgmental, tough guy. And he never stopped being that way. And he let us know when he was unhappy with rough cuts of Band of Brothers. Okay. And so I sort of had the Major's voice over my shoulder as I was working on Masters of the Air, that we had to honor them with, or at least I did, with as much truth as we could muster. And, you see a lot of death in Masters of the Air, a lot of the casualty rate was like 78%. And, I sort of felt like those were real, when you see a plane blow up, 10 guys that, were fighting fascism just died. And they were really up there. There were really 10 guys up there that just blew up. And I wanted to make sure that even if you didn't know who they were, that we showed that event as accurately as at least I could. Like I said, there was a lot of people. It was a very collaborative show. So I didn't always have the final word on what you see in the show. But I always was arguing for, well, did that really happen? A funny story. So also in episode 5, when Rosie is the last plane, so spoiler alert, those 13 planes that I mentioned earlier, 12 of them are shot down and only one remains. Well, being a single B-17 without being part of a formation is the worst thing you can be, because when you're part of a formation, all of the 10 or 11 guns that are on a B-17 kind of create a cloud of defensive fire. When you're just one, you don't have that cloud of defensive fire, and you have a giant target on your back. So Rosie had done, before he became a pilot in theater, he had been a pilot in Texas as a teacher, basically, of gunners. So he had logged thousands of hours as a B-17 pilot before he ever got to theater. So when he was alone up there by himself and he is attacked, he did some really radical maneuvers that you don't normally do in a B-17.
Right.
So much so that one of our technical advisors, who was a B-17 pilot, like today, younger guy, but he flies B-17s, and takes people up for rides and stuff. He read the script and read those sequences and said, well, you can't do that in a B-17. A lazy S and I can't remember all the names of the maneuvers. And I said, well, maybe you can't do that in a B-17. But Robert Rosenthal did.
Oh my God. What did he say?
We got into an argument about it, and I had to pull up evidence that's indeed what Rosie did.
Wow. That's so cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
So we really tried to, show the truth as we knew it.
Yeah, and I've heard also that all the stories of the things that the guys were doing were also like they happened to somebody, even if they didn't happen to those characters. Everything is based on reality. It seems like from start to finish throughout the entire thing. You're really kind of getting this immersive thing.
Do you want me to give you an example of that?
Yeah, give me an example. I want examples.
So when John Egan, played by Callum Turner, was shot down, he was on the run for 4 days, and then he was recaptured. We don't know what happened in those 4 days, and we don't know really anything about from him being shot down to him arriving in Stalag Luft 3 and reuniting with Clevin, which really happened. They were in the same barracks historically. And so I had to figure out some way to dramatize those 4 days. So I just looked in all the books and figured out, this is what the interrogations would have been like. And there was a story of pilots, a real event in a town called Russelsheim. And Egan was not there, but I put him there. So that our audience could see what would happen when our flyboys would walk into a German town that had just been bombed. The Germans weren't the civilians weren't so happy when they encountered bomber crews, American bomber crews. And often they would lynch them, or what happens in the show when they kill all of those guys. That did really happen. Just it didn't happen to Egan.
I think that we can all really appreciate that you put those things in there. So it's kind of this, like you were saying, responsibility where you don't let these stories die off in the wind. Like, people can actually see some of these things that happen to these people. And so I, as a viewer, appreciate that. And a historian, I appreciate that a lot. And I'm sure that took a lot of time to figure out which stories did you have to kind of pick and choose, like, I want to tell this and this one?
I could have done a 40-hour show.
I bet.
But yes, that was, that's part of it all. That's generally that's in the early kind of side of things. So I found the Russelsheim story years and years and years before we wrote the scripts.
I see. It just like pops up a little bit after. The other thing too, on the subject of realism and reality in the show, there's so many little things that you would never think of in a plane, where you're like, oh, frostbite if you touch something super, super cold, or people throwing up because they get sick. And I thought that you did it, and that obviously the director and the actors and everything involved, but I thought the writing was done so well in that it didn't break the fourth wall, and it all just kind of blends in there, and it wasn't over the top. Was that hard to do, or you kind of like had to adjust things a little bit?
That's part of the DNA of these shows, Band, The Pacific, and this, and trying to be as realistic as we can while also telling a story. So, we bring up the cold only in the first episode, I think, or the second episode. But that was an ongoing thing. It was usually around -40 degrees Fahrenheit. And
yikes.
It's an unpressurized cabin. There's no heater. There's no air, so you have to have an oxygen mask, and it's -40 degrees. Oh, and the Nazis are shooting at you.
Right. And by the way.
Yeah. So we wanted to get that in there. One of the pilots that I did interview, who's still alive, an amazing man named John Luckadoo, nicknamed Lucky. He's not in the show, but for him, that was one of his biggest memories, is you just cannot believe how cold it was. And, they're up there for 6 hours, 8 hours in that cold.
-40? Like, you don't even really, those are the kinds of things where, in Alaska or in the Antarctic, they're like, you're going to cry or die or something if you heard that's nuts. And did they really fly sometimes in their underwear, even risking the frostbite? Like, that is crazy.
No, the flying in the underwear story is true. Rosie, it was in a version of the scripts where we saw it, and it ended up just sort of, as these things go, they just become a story, and I think it's in there somewhere. But Rosie, it was in Texas when Rosie was training those other gunners, and it was 100 degrees in the summer in Texas. So, and they didn't go up when they would do those practice missions. They were gunnery practice missions. So what would happen is Rosie in a B-17 would be flying a B-17, and then another B-17 would be flying a target, behind it, like a giant kite. And then the gunners in Rosie's plane would try to shoot that giant kite. And that's how they would learn how to use live ammunition. They didn't have to go up to 25,000 feet to do that. Sure. Okay. So it was not that cold when they were in their underwear.
Okay, I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, what Do you know, like, the risk of, let's say, being up in the air, being shot at, and there's all this flak going on, versus the risk of casualties versus being on the ground, let's say on D-Day? Both are very high. If you could, just for our listeners who might not have an idea of the difference, is it similar?
It was really basically the only kind of fighting man in World War II who had a higher casualty rate was submarines. Way more casualty rate in the 8th Air Force in 43 and 42 and early 44 than the Marines in the Pacific. Yes. This is so in 1943, you had to complete 25 missions and then you got to go home, right? The problem was the average lifespan of a B-17 was 7 missions.
Oh.
So every mission after 7, you were on borrowed time and you knew it. So, for example, in the show, the 100th Bomber Group arrives in June of 43 with 36 airplanes, 36 ships. And by the time Egan goes down in the first week of October, 34 of the original 36 B-17s had been shot down.
Wow. So it's pretty up there.
Well, that's really up there, right? Like the first crews that arrived, when we didn't have the numbers yet, we didn't have the P-51. So they had no protection once they crossed the channel. The P-47s could only fly to around Belgium and back. Okay. So once they crossed Belgium, it was just the B-17s. So they had the flak, and then they had the fighters, and they had no protection. And one of the things that you had to do, the theory was, as I said earlier, what was called a box formation, meaning the B-17s were arranged in a sort of up and down and left and right formation that sort of created what they called a combat box. And you were not allowed to deviate at all. So when you were in formation, you go, oh my God, there's a Focke Wolf attacking me and I'm going to just swerve out of formation. You could not do it.
Really?
You were not allowed to. You had to just sit there in formation as all of these German planes were trying to shoot you down. So as a result, particularly in the first sort of, well, really until the P-51 showed up, the casualty rates were huge, just huge. It was 78% were either killed or wounded or POWs from the 8th Air Force. And in early 43, it was much higher than that, you know?
Goodness.
I mean, for the original group of the 100th Bomber Group, it's like 90%.
Oh my God. So you'd want to be on one of the ground forces
completely.
In the air. What kind of person it took to go up there? That is wild. I can't even imagine the fortitude.
Well, that's why they had what they called flak houses, where Rosie goes in episode 6, because the mental anguish was the psychological effects of having to get back into that plane again, knowing the odds were you were going to die in that plane or get captured, you know, if you were lucky. And it was a very difficult, I don't know how they did it, you know.
That it's interesting. We had a guest on a few weeks ago who specializes in 18th century warfare. And it just reminds me of, we were talking about the innovation of ammo on the battlefield and how difficult it was for people to be fired upon and hold your fire until the enemy got closer because of the small range of the musket, and how difficult and how much ammo was wasted by people not being able to hold back. So when you're talking about flying and you can't go away, that's even crazier, and you're freezing and there's no protection and you're in the air. So if you get shot, it's not like you go, oh, I'm on the ground, maybe I'll survive.
Exactly.
I can't imagine being the type of person
literally
going
is an
there.
aluminum can.
Oh.
You know, it is there is no armor. I think there's one or two plates in the nose below. Sorry if you can hear my dog. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
There's one or two steel plates right below the pilots, but it didn't really do anything. And other than that, there was no armor in a B-17 because they would be too heavy and it would lessen its range, right? So the idea was to have the plane as light as possible. And the theory was because they had so many guns, 50 caliber machine guns, that they would be, that's why they were called the Flying Fortress. The thought was that they were invulnerable because of all the machine guns. And in practice, that was not true.
Oh my God, horrific. And then you have to think, did you learn anything about, there's the risk of, what was the casualty rate of, okay, you got to eject, you got to parachute down, you got to land God knows where. Are you going to land in a anti-Nazi village? Are you going to land in a German village that thinks you just bombed them, like you were saying before? What is the casualty rate of that? Like, was it survivable often?
Yes. Yeah. No, there was a huge amount of American bomber boys in the Stalags. I think I don't want to give a number because it's probably going to be wrong, but definitely tens of thousands of airmen were captured who bailed out of airplanes. Literally tens of thousands. There's at least 10,000. There were almost 10,000 Americans, I think, in Stalag Luft 3. Maybe that's wrong. I can't remember. So you were lucky. I mean, if you bailed out, you were probably going to be okay. Not always. I mean, there is a shot in the episode where a bailing out crew member is killed by the wing of another plane. That would happen. The Germans, depending upon when in the war and what unit you were fighting, the Germans would sometimes try to shoot down the guys in parachutes. Others wouldn't. It was sort of like the Luftwaffe was a very complicated thing. Because they kind of considered themselves above morally the SS and the Gestapo and even the Wehrmacht.
Well, that's a low bar, but yeah.
It is a low bar, completely. So they sort of, some of the pilots sort of felt there was an honor among the flying, forces, the Americans, the British, and the Germans. Yeah. Other pilots were not so cool with that and would try to shoot down Americans. The other thing that's kind of interesting is we had the luxury of being able to train our pilots out of the combat zone in America. Mm-hmm. The Germans could not do that. So what ended up happening was our guys could go home after 25 missions, then it was increased to 30 and then 35. The Germans had no such policy. Jeez. You flew until you died. And
How crazy would that make somebody? That would just make you crazy. That would just do crazy things.
Yeah. And what ended up happening was eventually their first tier pilots and the fighters were shot down just by attrition,
Sure.
And so their secondary fighter pilots were not as well trained because they didn't have the time to train them like we did, and the luxury of having the training happening out of the combat zone. And so eventually we just sort of outnumbered them. I mean, we made, I think it's 12,000 B-17s and 16 or 18,000 B-24s. I mean, that's 30,000 bombers that we made. 30,000. It's an extraordinary feat.
Yeah. Like how much manufacturing in World War II happened in the U.S. Way more than anywhere else.
Way more. and the system was different, right? We used Henry Ford's factory system,
right?
And neither the Japanese nor the Germans did. They were bespoke, boutique building of planes. And so they built their planes much, much slower and in much, much fewer numbers. We had this sort of factory system that really just outmatched them in every way possible.
And that still carries through to today.
Yeah. But you know, I think about the number of 30,000 bombers.
It's crazy.
You know, right now, I don't think we have 1,000 fighting planes in the Army. I mean, in the Air Force, in the Marines, in the Navy. Really? I don't think we have a total of 1,000 planes. Maybe we have 1,200. I don't know.
Huh.
But just to put it in context, what a just enormous number this was.
Yeah, well, that also makes sense for why it was such thin material, too, because you're just like rapid fire producing all of these planes. That's wild. I just can't even imagine going up in there. The more I learn about it, the more it just blows my mind that we had people that were able to do that. And it's funny that you're talking about how some Germans would be kind of respectful of like, let's not shoot at falling paratroopers. It reminds me of in the Quentin Roosevelt, the President Roosevelt's son, who was shot down in World War I, and the Germans like found him and held this ceremony of honor and buried him. And it was like this thing where they're like, "Oops, we wish that we hadn't."
Particularly in World War I.
Yeah,
that was more so in World War I.
Yeah,
because in World War II. We were bombing cities. In World War I, we were
different then.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, granted, I would like to point out that the Nazis were the first civilization or the first culture that bombed civilians purposely. In Spain during the Spanish Civil War, and then where Guernica, the famous painting by Picasso, it was the Condor Squadron from Germany that did that. And then when the war started, they bombed Warsaw, Rotterdam, way before the English bombed any German city or before we obviously even entered the war. So it was the Germans who decided, hey, boys, this is total war, and we are going to destroy your cities if you don't, give up. And so we ended up doing the same.
Yeah, they really did go all out on the total warfare concept. They definitely started that first, and we were kind of doing it in response to that to just make them stop. I wanted to ask about the British bombers that the series goes into how they flew at night, and they had reasons for that. And the U.S. was flying more in the day.
Not more, and only.
Only in the day.
Only in the day, and the Brits were only at night. So when the war started, the Brits tried to do daylight bombing, but the casualties were just too high. So they decided to do nighttime bombing, but that meant it was indiscriminate. You couldn't really see your target. So they did it at night, and we, in the hubris of America, said, well, we can do better. We have the Norton bomb sight, this magic piece of computing that could compensate for altitude, a wind, blah, blah, blah. And theoretically, it was super, super accurate as long as you could see what you were doing, which meant daylight bombing. And at first, the British, Churchill was against it. He was like, you're just going to have too many deaths. Yeah. And I can't remember if it was not Hap Arnold. I can't remember which Air Force general, Spatz maybe, convinced Churchill to let us try. I think it was after Casablanca, to try the daylight bombing. And it was not a pretty picture for a long time, really until the P-51s came in. That's when the air war sort of shifted.
Okay. I wanted to ask, before we go here, I just have a couple more questions.
No, take your time. I can talk about this stuff, well, for 10 hours at least.
Yeah, for at least.
Because I wrote a show about it for 10 hours. So, yeah.
Can I ask, why did HBO decide not to go with the series after all of that development?
Well, that was, so HBO went through one sales change while we were there. So when we started working on the show in 2014 is when I started working on it. HBO was owned by Time Warner. And then in like 2017, I want to say, AT&T bought HBO and Time Warner and Warner Brothers and all of these things. And, it was not an inexpensive show to make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so ultimately AT&T, the head of AT&T made the decision, literally, to not make Masters of the Air because it was too expensive. So, luckily, Apple said, well, we'll make it, so that's the short answer. And then, by the way, AT&T sold it to Discovery, right? So HBO is now owned by a whole different person. Or people.
That was a weird merger when that happened. I was like, didn't see that coming.
I think the idea originally was like, AT&T would be using mobile phones, and there would be some sort of connectivity between the libraries of Warner Brothers, HBO, Cinemax, all those things with AT&T, but it didn't work. It didn't happen.
Yeah, that's interesting. Not as weird as merging with Discovery, but What was that like a hard thing to get Apple? Was Apple just like, hey, over here, guys? Or did you have to go in to be like, look, there's this thing that we want to do?
Yeah, it was that, we sent them the scripts, the Bible. We had a big meeting with Spielberg and Hanks and Gary Getzman and me and the head honchos at Apple. And we sort of, laid out our vision and they were like, okay, let's do this. So very, very fortunate. Yeah, very fortunate.
Masterpiece. It is very, So I had to put everything down when I was watching it. It was very, very engrossing. So, you had a hand in Band of Brothers, and now there's Masters of the Air. Is there another war that you're interested in writing about, or is it just like what do?
I've just had a conversation today about something that I cannot talk about.
No,
but it is a different century.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh.
No, I'm. Well, these things are very hard to get made. Because, even when you have Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg, they're very hard. That doesn't guarantee. As I said, I started working on Masters of the Air in 2014, and it didn't come out until 2025, and as I said, HBO declined to make it, right?
Yeah.
So, and it's because they're expensive, you're creating a whole world, as opposed to a drama that takes place in the present day, where you can just go into a living room and it's a living room, or you can, go down the highway and it's a highway. Well, you can't do that in period,
period pieces are very, very hard to get.
So, they're tough to get made. So I'm actually working on two different things that are in different eras.
Okay. Maybe we'll hear about it soon?
Not soon. No, these things take a long time. But I'm super excited about them both.
Okay. Well, on that note, there is one last thing I wanted to ask you about.
Sure.
So I'm really excited to ask you about this, actually. You are working on the new Battlestar Galactica project.
I did. I am not. That was a long time ago. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Is it happening? Is it not happening?
I have no idea. It was literally like 12 years ago that I wrote. I wrote the first feature film idea of rebooting Battlestar Galactica.
Really?
Yeah. So it was a feature. And oh man, it's such a good idea. I can't really tell you. It's
okay.
But they're not making it, so it doesn't matter. I don't know who is working on it now. If there's a writer, yeah, I think it's been going through different writers, which is pretty normal in the world of movies. It's very rare for a screenwriter to be like the only screenwriter that ever works on it. So I was the first writer on it, and it didn't come together for a lot of reasons, not the least of which was Bryan Singer was the director attached, and he sort of imploded for very, very legitimate reasons, and kind of killed this version. And then other writers have come in and come up with ideas. And
it's almost like it's not as big of a responsibility as telling these real life stories, but there is a huge following of Battlestar Galactica. And I personally, when I married my husband, our first dance as husband and wife was one of the Bear McCreary songs, The Shape of Things to Come.
He's so brilliant.
Yes. So The Shape of Things to Come, that's from the Battlestar Galactica with, Ron
Moore.
Yes, thank you. I'm like, why?
So I will tease you with this. So Ron Moore is a huge fan of Masters of the Air. And we've had a few conversations. We've never worked together. We don't know each other. We want to work together.
Oh, that would be amazing.
And so I was talking to him, and it was just what we call a general meeting. It's just kind of a get to know you. And I said, oh, hey, by the way, I wrote a feature version of Battlestar. Do you mind if I tell you the idea? And I could kind of see he was like, oh, God, everybody's told me ideas of what they think Battlestar should be.
Okay.
And I gave him the idea, and he went, oh, that's a really good idea.
No way.
Yeah.
That's a huge compliment. No way.
I know. I love this idea. But I can't, I can't tell you.
Oh, okay. Well, it's out there. It's in the universe. It's floating out in the air, and I'm so mad that I can't know it and see it. So fingers crossed.
You and me both. It's
Do you feel the pressure of like, okay, I've got to carry on this show a little bit with that?
I feel the pressure on every project I do because I find writing to be really difficult and painful and mostly unpleasant. So I really need to love what I'm doing. I've turned down a lot of big money gigs because I just don't like the material.
Oh, really? Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I won't say what, but, yeah, like really, big movies that I was just like, I don't want to do that. I really have to believe in what I'm writing. Even if it's something like Battlestar, but even like, I don't know if you saw, I wrote a movie called Legend of the Guardians, which is a animated movie directed by Zack Snyder. And it's about talking owls that wear armor and wield swords. And but my version is basically a metaphor of fascism. And so I could really get into it because it was about fighting fascists.
Wow.
Now, granted, the fascists are owls, but they're fascists.
That is crazy. Okay, I have to go check that out now. That is so cool. Wow. Yeah. It's funny because one of my other guests was Edward Habsburg. He's the Archduke of Austria and ambassador to the Holy See. It turns out he actually wrote this like zombie screenplay, and I'm like, I have to see what that is because
right.
I've read a lot of screenplays in my life, but that, and he's like, yeah, Habsburg zombies. I'm like, okay, Like, I need to see what that is.
It's sort of like, wasn't there that Lincoln zombie?
Yeah. I don't think I've seen that. I think I saw part of that once.
I'm not a zombie guy.
Oh, really?
I'm a little, no, I don't, it's like, okay, yeah, zombies. Like even like The Last of Us, it's like, oh, okay, zombies.
What about vampires? Would you do a vampire movie?
I do like vampires, I have to say.
Yeah, something about them.
But yeah, because they're sexy. There's something else going on. I really, as a kid, there was a Dracula made with Frank Langella playing Dracula that I really loved as a kid. Probably made in the early 80s, I want to say, maybe late 70s. And it's very sensual and
like Twilight.
Yeah. And I loved Anne Rice's books. Loved her books.
Yes.
I haven't seen the show, but I hear it's good. But I loved her books.
Absolutely. I would recommend the Vampire Diaries and the originals. Those are really, really good vampire shows. Very, very cool. So, man, I would love it if you did a vampire show. I think that would be really cool coming from you. So just that out there too. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I hope that we get to see more cool stuff and whatever other war thing you got going on.
Oh, you will. You will.
Okay. Very exciting. And then we'll have you on again if you do another war show. So thank you again. And have a good evening.
You as well.